In December of 1860, on a cotton plantation near Milledgeville, Georgia, a woman named Dinah committed an act so unspeakable that even the newspapers of the time struggled to convey its horror without collapsing into silence. On Christmas night, while carols echoed faintly from the main house and candles flickered in windows meant to celebrate the birth of mercy, Dinah took an axe from the woodshed and methodically killed her master, Colonel Harrison Whitfield, and 4 of his children as they slept in their beds. The brutality was surgical, the silence afterward was absolute. You are on the Shadows of the South Channel, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slaveholding South, stories that reveal not just what happened, but what such a system made inevitable. The Whitfield plantation stretched across nearly 800 acres of red Georgia clay, positioned along the Oconee River, where the land rolled in gentle waves toward forests of pine and oak. Colonel Harrison Whitfield, 43 years old at the time of his death, was a graduate of the University of Georgia, a Presbyterian elder, and a man who prided himself on what he called enlightened management of his human property. He owned approximately 170 enslaved people, making him one of the wealthier planters in Baldwin County. His cotton operation was immaculate, his yields impressive, his reputation in Milledgeville society unimpeachable. He was known as a man of breeding and education, someone who quoted scripture at dinner and spoke often of his duties as a Christian steward. His wife, Margaret Whitfield, had died 3 years prior during the birth of their 6th child, leaving Harrison to raise 5 surviving children ranging in age from 3 to 14. The eldest, Harrison Jr., was being groomed to take over the plantation. The youngest, little Samuel, had just learned to walk. Dinah was 31 years old in 1860. She had been born on the Whitfield property, the daughter of a field hand named Moses and a woman named Celia, who had died of fever when Dinah was 7. From childhood, Dinah was marked as exceptional. She was literate, a rarity that Colonel Whitfield permitted because she served as a house slave, and he believed a reading servant could better follow written instructions. She was tall, strongly built, with dark eyes that seemed to absorb everything and reveal nothing. Other enslaved people on the plantation described her as quiet, intensely private, someone who moved through the main house like a shadow. She had borne 3 children, all of whom had been sold away before their 10th birthdays, a fact that was never discussed in the main house but was understood by everyone in the quarters. Colonel Whitfield trusted her implicitly. She prepared his meals, laundered his linens, managed the other house servants, and cared for his children with what he interpreted as devotion. What the colonel did not know, or perhaps chose not to acknowledge, was that Dinah's 3rd child, a boy named Joseph, had been his own son. Joseph had been sold to a cotton trader from Alabama in 1857, 3 years before the massacre, when the boy was 9 years old. The sale had been arranged quietly, during a Sunday afternoon, when most of the household was at church. Dinah had not been permitted to say goodbye. She had stood in the kitchen doorway and watched the wagon disappear down the road, her face expressionless, her hands gripping the doorframe so tightly that splinters drove into her palms. Colonel Whitfield never spoke of it. He instructed the overseer to ensure that Dinah received no letters, no information, no confirmation of where the boy had gone or whether he still lived. In the colonel's moral framework, this was mercy. He had not separated mother and child out of cruelty, he told himself, but out of necessity. The boy's resemblance to the Whitfield line had become too obvious, and whispers had begun to circulate among the neighboring plantations. Reputation, after all, was everything. The other key figures in this tragedy were the remaining house servants, Big Jacob, a 40-year-old man who served as butler and stable manager, steady and careful, someone who had learned to anticipate moods and avoid confrontation. Patience, a 17-year-old girl, recently brought up from the fields to assist Dinah, eager and frightened and desperate to please. And old Ruth, a woman in her 60s, who had nursed Colonel Whitfield as a child, and now occupied a strange liminal status in the household, neither entirely enslaved nor entirely free, living in a small room off the kitchen and speaking only when spoken to. There was also Henry, the blacksmith, 35 years old, who worked in the forge near the quarters and who had known Dinah since childhood. Henry was the only person Dinah spoke to with anything approaching openness, though even he would later say that he never truly knew what moved through her mind during those final months. Pause for a moment and reflect on what it meant to live as Dinah lived. Every day she dressed the children who were free, while her own children were chattel. She prepared meals for a man who had used her body and then erased the evidence of his own paternity by selling his own son into oblivion. She moved through rooms filled with Christmas garlands and laughter while carrying a grief so vast it had no language, no outlet, no acknowledgement. In a system where even maternal love was property, what remained of the soul? The precise trigger for what happened on Christmas night remains contested in the historical record, as much of the evidence was destroyed or suppressed by the Whitfield family after the event. But testimony from surviving enslaved people, gathered by a circuit judge in the weeks following the massacre, suggests that the catalyst arrived in mid-December of 1860. A letter came to the plantation, addressed to Colonel Whitfield, but intercepted by Dinah when she sorted the morning mail. The letter was from an overseer in Alabama, a man named Corbett, informing the colonel that a young slave named Joseph, approximately 12 years old, had died of pneumonia the previous month. The letter was brief and administrative in tone. It requested payment for burial costs and included an inventory number. Dinah could not have known for certain that this Joseph was her son. There were thousands of enslaved boys named Joseph across the South, but she knew something in the cold efficiency of the letter, the reduction of a child to a line item, the casual mention of burial costs owed, confirmed what she had always feared. Her boy had died alone, sick, and forgotten, far from anyone who knew his name or remembered the sound of his voice. Dinah replaced the letter in its envelope, set it on Colonel Whitfield's desk as though she had never opened it, and went about her duties. For the next 10 days, she gave no indication that anything had changed. She served breakfast with the same quiet efficiency. She supervised the decoration of the house for Christmas with the same attention to detail. She helped patients hang evergreen garlands in the parlor and arrange candles on the mantelpiece. She baked gingerbread with the children and listened to young Harrison Jr. read passages from the Gospel of Luke. She moved through time as though she had already left her body, as though she were watching herself from a great distance, preparing for something she had not yet named. On Christmas Eve, Colonel Whitfield held his traditional gathering for the overseers and their families. The main house glowed with firelight and candlelight. There was roasted ham, sweet potato pie, syllabub, and whiskey. The colonel stood in his parlor and spoke about the importance of maintaining discipline during uncertain times. South Carolina had seceded from the Union just 5 days prior, on December 20th, and everyone knew that Georgia would soon follow. There was talk of war, of honor, of defending a way of life that God Himself had ordained. The colonel quoted Ephesians, "Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in singleness of your heart, as unto Christ." The overseers nodded. Their wives sipped wine and discussed the difficulties of managing servants who had grown insolent with all the political agitation. No one noticed Dinah standing in the doorway to the kitchen, holding a tray of empty glasses, her face as still as carved stone. After the guests departed, the household settled into the routines of Christmas night. The children were sent upstairs to bed, their stockings hung by the fireplace. Colonel Whitfield sat in his study and worked on correspondence, recording the year's cotton yields and expenditures. Big Jacob banked the fires and locked the doors. Old Ruth went to her room off the kitchen. Patience, exhausted from the day's labor, fell asleep in the servants' quarter. By midnight, the plantation was silent, except for the sound of wind moving through the pines and the occasional bark of a dog in the distance. Dinah did not sleep. She waited in her small room adjacent to the kitchen until she was certain everyone had settled. Then she rose, dressed in her work clothes, and walked across the cold yard to the woodshed. The moon was full, casting sharp shadows across the frozen ground. She selected an axe from the tool rack, a heavy implement used for splitting firewood, its blade recently sharpened by Henry the blacksmith. She tested its weight in her hands. Then she walked back to the main house, entered through the kitchen door she had left unlocked, and climbed the stairs to the second floor. What happened next was reconstructed from physical evidence and the testimony of Big Jacob, who was awakened by sounds he initially mistook for the house settling in the cold. Dinah entered Colonel Whitfield's bedroom first. He was asleep, lying on his side beneath a heavy quilt. She struck him once at the base of the skull, a blow delivered with such force that death would have been instantaneous. She did not strike again. She did not linger. She moved to the next room, where 14-year-old Harrison Jr. slept, then to the room shared by the two middle children, Anne and Thomas, aged 11 and 9, finally to the nursery where little Samuel, 3 years old, slept in his crib. Each death was swift, each blow was precise. There was no hesitation, no variation in method. When it was finished, Dinah descended the stairs, walked through the kitchen, and placed the axe on the kitchen table. She washed her hands in the basin by the door. Then she walked out into the yard, crossed to the quarters, and woke Big Jacob. "Go to town," she told him. "Tell them what I've done." Big Jacob, disoriented and terrified, initially refused to believe her, but when he saw her face, saw the blood on her dress, saw the terrible calm in her eyes, he understood. He saddled a horse and rode through the night to Milledgeville, arriving at the sheriff's office just after dawn on Christmas morning. By the time the authorities returned to the plantation, Dinah was sitting on the steps of the main house, waiting. The two children who survived were the eldest daughter, Catherine, age 12, who had been visiting her aunt in Macon, and an infant, 6-month-old Margaret, who had been sleeping in old Ruth's room, and was spared because Dinah had not known she was there. These two survivors would later testify that they had never witnessed any cruelty from Dinah, never heard her raise her voice, never seen any indication of violence or madness. Catherine Whitfield would spend the rest of her life trying to reconcile the woman who had taught her to sew with the woman who had killed her father and siblings. She would never succeed. Consider for a moment the architecture of a system so complete, so totalizing, that it could transform a mother's grief into this. Dinah was not insane. Every person who knew her, including those who condemned her, agreed on this point. She was methodical, intelligent, fully aware of what she was doing and what the consequences would be. The massacre was not a crime of passion or a sudden break with reality. It was a decision made in full consciousness by a woman who had been denied every other form of power, every other means of asserting that her child's life had mattered, that his death required acknowledgement, that somewhere in this world there must be a reckoning. The trial was held in February of 1861 in the Baldwin County Courthouse. The proceedings lasted 3 hours. Dinah did not deny what she had done. She did not plead insanity or claim she had been provoked beyond reason. When asked by the judge why she had committed such an act, she said only, "My boy died alone, and nobody told me." The prosecutor presented evidence of Colonel Whitfield's good character, his kindness to his servants, his reputation as a Christian gentleman. He described Dinah as a monster, a creature of unfathomable evil, who had violated the most sacred bonds of trust. The defense attorney, a young man named Carlyle, who had been appointed by the court and clearly wanted no part of the case, offered no meaningful resistance. The jury deliberated for 20 minutes. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death by hanging. Dinah was executed on March 15, 1861, in the public square in Milledgeville. Hundreds attended. Some came out of a sense of civic duty, others out of morbid curiosity, still others because they were enslaved people who had been forced by their owners to witness the consequences of resistance. Dinah walked to the scaffold without assistance. She did not speak. She did not weep. She did not ask for mercy or forgiveness. When the noose was placed around her neck, she looked out over the crowd, her face expressionless, and waited. Witnesses later reported that the silence before the trap door opened was so complete that they could hear birds singing in the trees surrounding the square. The Whitfield plantation was never the same. The remaining family members, Catherine and infant Margaret, were sent to live with relatives in Savannah. The house itself stood empty for several years, avoided by overseers and neighboring planters who claimed they could hear sounds at night, weeping, they said, or the sound of an axe striking wood. The enslaved people who remained on the property were eventually sold off piecemeal as the Whitfield estate was liquidated to pay debts. Big Jacob was sold to a plantation in South Carolina. Patience disappeared into the chaos of the Civil War and was never heard from again. Old Ruth died in her sleep 6 months after the massacre. Some said of heartbreak, others of simple age. Henry the blacksmith survived the war and eventually made his way to Atlanta, where he worked as a freedman and lived until 1893. In his old age, he was interviewed by a researcher interested in documenting the experiences of formerly enslaved people. When asked about Dinah, Henry said only, "She carried more than any person should carry. Something had to break. It just happened that what broke was the world around her, instead of herself." If you are following this story, if these histories matter to you, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. These are not easy narratives. They demand that we sit with discomfort, that we acknowledge what our ancestors were capable of, that we refuse the comfort of distance. But this work is necessary. These voices, these tragedies, these moments when the unspeakable became real, they must not be forgotten. The historical record of the Dinah massacre was systematically suppressed. The Whitfield family paid to have newspaper coverage minimized. Court documents were sealed or lost. Local histories written in the decades after the Civil War made no mention of the case, as though it had never occurred. It was not until the 1930s, when the Works Progress Administration conducted interviews with elderly African Americans who had been enslaved, that fragments of the story began to resurface. Even then, the details were contested, embellished, or sanitized, depending on who was telling the story and for what purpose. What we know with certainty is this: Dinah existed, Joseph existed, Colonel Harrison Whitfield existed. 5 people died on Christmas night in 1860, killed by a woman who had been given no other language for her grief, no other mechanism for making the powerful acknowledge what they had taken. The massacre was not justice, it was not redemption. It was the inevitable endpoint of a system that treated human beings as instruments, that severed every natural bond, that made motherhood itself a form of property to be managed and disposed of at will. In the years following the Civil War, the site of the Whitfield plantation was slowly reclaimed by forest. The main house collapsed in the 1880s, its timbers rotting, its windows broken by vandals or weather. The quarters where enslaved people had lived disappeared even faster, their rougher construction offering less resistance to time and neglect. By the turn of the 20th century, there was nothing left but foundation stones and a few scattered bricks. Local children sometimes played in the ruins, unaware of what had happened there, unaware that they were walking over ground soaked in a particular species of American tragedy. Catherine Whitfield, the surviving daughter, married a banker from Augusta in 1868 and lived until 1921. She never spoke publicly about the massacre. Her descendants, interviewed in the 1970s by a graduate student researching antebellum violence, said that Catherine had kept a small daguerreotype of Dinah in a locked drawer, though no one knew why or what it meant to her. The photograph has since been lost. Margaret Whitfield, the infant who survived, grew up knowing almost nothing of her family's history. She was told her father and siblings had died of fever, a lie maintained by her relatives,
until her death in 1934. It was only in going through her effects that her children discovered letters and documents that revealed the truth. The question that haunts this story, the question that refuses resolution, is not whether Dinah was a monster. The question is what kind of society produces such an act, what kind of moral universe makes such violence not only possible, but in some terrible sense, inevitable. Dinah was not born violent, she was made into an instrument of death by a system that first made her an instrument of labor, of reproduction, of property accumulation. Every day she woke and performed the rituals of servitude. Every day she swallowed her grief, her rage, her absolute powerlessness. Every day she watched free children play, while her own children were sold like livestock. And then, one December night, in 1860, something fundamental broke, not her mind, her silence. Think about the moral calculus of slaveholding Christianity, the breathtaking hypocrisy of men like Colonel Whitfield, who quoted scripture about servants obeying masters while simultaneously raping enslaved women and selling their own children. Think about a society so invested in its own righteousness that it could not see the monstrous contradiction at its core. Think about what it required of people like Dinah, not just their labor, but their complicity in their own dehumanization, their performance of contentment, their suppression of every natural human response to violation and loss. And then ask yourself, in such a system, who were the real monsters? The South preferred to forget cases like Dinah's. They disrupted the mythology of the contented slave, the benevolent master, the harmonious plantation household. They revealed what lay beneath the surface of all that gracious living in Christian piety, a foundation of terror, exploitation, and unacknowledged guilt. In the decades after the war, when former slaveholders wrote their memoirs and lost cause advocates rewrote history, stories like Dinah's were erased or transformed into cautionary tales about the dangers of poorly managed servants, the grief that drove Dinah to murder, the systematic destruction of her family, the routine cruelty disguised as paternalism. All of this was swept aside in favor of narratives that made white Southerners feel comfortable with their ancestors. But the truth does not disappear simply because we refuse to speak it. It persists in fragments, in court records, and WPA interviews, in ghost stories and local legends, in the gaps and silences of official histories. It persists in the descendants of enslaved people who carry the genetic memory of trauma, who know instinctively what their ancestors endured, even when the specific stories have been lost. It persists in the land itself, in the soil that bore witness, in the trees that stood silent while unspeakable things occurred beneath their branches. Dinah's story is not unique. Across the antebellum South, there were hundreds, perhaps thousands of similar cases, acts of desperate violence committed by enslaved people, pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. Most were never recorded. Most left no trace in the historical record, beyond a line in a plantation journal or a brief newspaper notice. The archive of slavery is an archive of silences, of voices deliberately suppressed, of stories deemed too dangerous or too shameful to preserve. What we have recovered is only a fraction of what actually occurred, and even that fraction has been filtered through the perspectives of those who held power and controlled the narrative. When we tell these stories now, we are not sensationalizing tragedy. We are not exploiting suffering for entertainment. We are performing an act of historical recovery, of bearing witness, of refusing to let the powerful dictate which stories deserve to be remembered. Dinah's name should be spoken. Joseph's name should be spoken. The names of the 5 people who died on Christmas night in 1860 should be spoken. All of them were casualties of slavery, the enslaved and the enslavers alike, all caught in a system that degraded everyone it touched, that turned human beings into monsters and victims and sometimes both at once. The Christmas of 1860 marked a turning point, not just for the Whitfield family, but for the nation. Within months of Dinah's execution, Georgia would secede from the Union. Within a year, the Civil War would be fully engaged, and the institution of slavery would begin its long, violent collapse. Whether there is any causal connection between individual acts of resistance, like Dinah's, and the larger forces that brought down the slaveholding regime, is a question historians continue to debate. What is certain is that by 1860, the system had become unsustainable. Too much grief, too much rage, too many people like Dinah who had nothing left to lose. These stories reveal the true price of power, not just what it costs to maintain, but what it costs the soul to wield it without conscience. Colonel Whitfield thought himself a good man. He went to church, he provided for his family, he believed in his own benevolence, even as he sold his own son, and worked human beings to death in his fields. This is the lie. Slavery required its beneficiaries to believe that they were good people presiding over a natural order, that the suffering they caused was either invisible or deserved. Dinah's axe shattered that lie. For one terrible night, it made the cost visible, it forced acknowledgement, it said this child existed, this child died, this loss matters, and someone must answer for it. The legacy of that night extends beyond the immediate victims. It touches everyone who came after, the descendants of the Whitfield family, who carry the shame of their ancestors' actions, the descendants of enslaved people, who carry the trauma of systematic dehumanization, all of us who live in a nation still struggling to reckon with the implications of having built its wealth and power on such a foundation. We cannot undo what was done. We cannot resurrect the dead or heal wounds that cut so deep they have become part of our collective DNA, but we can refuse to forget. We can insist that these stories be told completely, honestly, without the comfortable distortions that allow us to imagine we would have behaved differently, that we would have been the exception, that we would have seen clearly what our society was doing and stood against it. The silence the South preferred to maintain has been broken, slowly, incompletely, but irreversibly, in archives and attics, in the testimony of descendants, and the work of historians who refuse to look away. Stories like Dinah's continue to emerge. They challenge us, they disturb us, they force us to confront not just the historical fact of slavery, but its ongoing implications, the ways its logic continues to shape our institutions and our assumptions about whose lives matter and whose suffering can be ignored. This is not comfortable work. It is not meant to be. Memory has a moral purpose. It demands that we look honestly at what we come from, that we acknowledge the full weight of our inheritance, and that we commit ourselves to ensuring that such systematic dehumanization never occurs again. If this story has moved you, if it has challenged you, if it has made you think differently about the history we were taught and the silences we were told to maintain, then share it, discuss it, refuse to let it be forgotten. The work of historical memory is not the responsibility of scholars alone. It belongs to all of us. We are all inheritors of this history. We all bear some portion of the responsibility for ensuring that the lessons it teaches are not lost. On Christmas night, in 1860, in a house in Georgia, a woman named Dinah made a choice. It was a terrible choice, born of a grief so profound, it had no outlet, no language, no acknowledgement in the society that had produced it. She destroyed 5 lives, and her own, in an act of desperate violence that solved nothing and changed nothing except to make visible, for one moment, the cost of a system that treated human beings as things. That visibility mattered. That moment of acknowledgement, purchased at such terrible cost, matters. Dinah's name matters. Joseph's name matters. What happened in that house matters, because it reveals a truth about power and powerlessness, about what happens when a society builds itself on the systematic destruction of family bonds and human dignity, about what becomes inevitable when mercy is only for those who can afford to buy it, and grief is only acknowledged when it belongs to those with social standing. These stories are difficult, they should be. History is not meant to make us comfortable, it is meant to make us honest. Remember Dinah of Georgia, remember what was done to her, and remember what she did. Remember that both are part of the same story, that you cannot understand one without the other, that the violence of that Christmas night in 1860 was born of a violence far greater and more systematic, a violence that an entire society participated in and profited from and called civilization. Remember, and do not look away.